All right, guys, this is our last section from the textbook for chapter 15. But we will watch a little bit more on the history of Earth and the first appearances of life. So that'll be your job Thursday and Friday this week. But this is the last section from the textbook for Unit 9 on evolution. So this is on evolution in action. So it's different ways that it works. So we're going to look at first these anole lizards. They are in the Caribbean, and they have varying body types here. You can see different colors. The legs are different lengths. The tails are different lengths. And so, right, just like Darwin wondering about the finches and the tortoises and the Galapagos, how did this variety of species come about in that one area? So our hypothesis here is that one common ancestor that had offspring moved to different islands. Somehow they got from one island to another, even without fins or flippers or some way to swim there. And then secondly, each lizard independently evolved on each island. So whatever trait was best adapted to that environment, that's what stuck around, and that's how we ended up with these different species. So it changed from being variation to speciation when it actually became a new species. So kind of what does that look like? Well, lizards somehow arrive on a new island. How they get there? Well, maybe they were on some piece of like driftwood and they floated there. There was a hurricane. They got blown there. Whatever the case might be, lizards land on a new island. Okay, so these are lizards that have different toe pads, different leg length, different tail length. And these trees could be on 3 separate islands, right? This is just putting it all in one picture, though. So perhaps, actually climbing a tree and have toe pads that are very large may not be advantageous if your predators are living in a tree. So it might be more beneficial for you to actually have longer legs, smaller toes, and maybe longer tails. Who knows? Whatever might actually be beneficial is going to survive. Okay? So the island lizard population increases. We have variation. Animals that have unfavorable combinations of leg length and toe pads die at a faster rate. Okay, and then what's left over turns into a new species over time. It's what's left there on the island. So this is kind of how it works in action, how they might have evolved. Okay, so types of evolution. The first one here is called convergent evolution. So in the case of the lizards, each twig-dwelling species evolved independently but formed similar traits, the ones that lived up in the branches. This is called convergent evolution. This is when different species evolve similar traits. You might remember in one of the last sections we were talking about traits that were shared among species but not necessarily having the same common ancestor. So for instance, like birds, bats, and moths all have wings because it's beneficial for them to have wings, but that doesn't necessarily mean they share the same common ancestor. So if you came to a habitat that had these 3 things that were all flying, well, we would call that convergent evolution, right? They all developed wings, but not necessarily having a common ancestor, a recent common ancestor. So the opposite of convergent evolution would be divergent evolution, where you have one species that diverges into 2 new species. So just like we saw with the lizards there on the island, basically you start with one, and then maybe some of them get large toes and small toes, and they develop into 2 different species. Where you can have the large-toed and short-legged ones caught on the ground, and the small-toed and long-legged ones fell from the trees and were caught. However, this might have happened. We end up with 2 different species coming from one common ancestor. So convergent, we end up with similar traits, not necessarily a common ancestor, though. Divergent, we start with a common ancestor and develop many different species from that. Okay, and then we have adaptive radiation. So this is a new population in a new environment that evolves to fill many parts of the environment. So, right, the lizard lands on the beach, okay, and we've seen this picture before, right, how this works, where it adapts to fill the environment, okay. Whatever potential place it could have, it's going to adapt to fit that, or it's not going to survive. Okay, so artificial selection. This is kind of an interesting point of evolution because we can start selecting traits and force species to start to diverge. So in artificial selection, the breeder chooses the individuals to be the parents of the next generation. So, where do we do this with commonly? Well, right, dogs. We'll get to them here in just a second. But we might do this with plants. Say you have a plant that produces a lot of a particular vegetable or fruit or whatever it might be. Well, you might want to choose to use that one as your parent to try to make more offspring that are better producing that. So, farmers, produce growers, they care about trying to find plants that produce more product, right? And then talking about dogs, right? Well, how do we end up with dogs like greyhounds? Well, if you got a dog that runs really fast and is shaped like a dog that runs really fast, and you breed it with other types of dogs that have very similar traits, we end up producing new breeds of dogs, right? That's how this comes about, right? So you wonder, how do we get something as large as a German Shepherd and as small as this kind of like miniature poodle over here? That's all artificial selection. That's choosing the parents, right, and determining what the offspring are going to look like. Darwin actually doubted all dogs came from one ancestor. He thought that there was just too much variation here for them to actually have been from the same ancestor. But actually, evidence is suggesting otherwise, that there was actually a common ancestor for all dogs. And just kind of another interesting fact about dogs, wild dogs and domestic dogs. Domesticated dogs didn't really start becoming a thing until about 15,000 years ago or so. So just in 15,000 years, we've been able to kind of take the wild, wolves and dog populations and get them into what we have today, which are not as wild, right? And their variation in species is pretty large, right? Small dogs, large dogs, long hair, short hair, and all over the world. Okay, and then our next one here is coevolution. This is when two or more species have evolved adaptations to each other's influence. So this is how one thing evolving might change another species. So this often involves symbiotic relationships where one species is reliant on the other one. They're mutually beneficial, right? So the example here might be a bee and a flower. So if this flower changes color from being purple for whatever reason to red, okay, the bee might evolve to, I don't know, sense the red color flower is better. Or maybe it's the smell of the pollen changes. The bee that can sense the pollen might have to change to that. So this is called coevolution. As one of these things changes, the other one will adapt to it or not survive. Okay? Humans and E. coli, right? You have a bacteria in your gut called E. coli that helps to break stuff down. You provide it with a warm, moist environment to grow in, and it provides you with some digestive help. Okay, and I don't know if I want to say too much on antibiotics and superbugs, because I might talk next week actually a little bit about viruses and immunology, but there could be a problem with antibiotics. If you take antibiotics, you're killing bacteria. Well, you do need this good bacteria in your gut to break stuff down. So if you're taking antibiotics, you actually start killing some of this stuff. And that's why some of the side effects of antibiotics is, we'll just say, gastric distress, because it's killing some of your bacteria that helps to break stuff down. Okay, and then here are some questions for review. I'll probably intersperse these into the video.